Hello, this is Liberty Mark 222 again. I'm going over this series about the church, the building of God, going through the different components. So far I went through the rock, who is Christ, the foundation, which is the doctrines of the apostles and the prophets, and basically the Bible, the written documentation of the church. Then the walls, which represent the people, the family of God, basically the congregation. And you have the windows, which are Jesus said we're the light of the world, and this is how we interact with the world. It says we're not of the world, but we're in the world. You have the light of Christ that comes in. You have it's a way that the world can see us, and we can interact with the world. And the doors represent the entering in and the going out of the church. So there's a certain process of whether when we're in the church or outside of the church, which is represented in a sense by baptism, when we are born again, when we go down into the water, then the old man dies, and when we come up, it represents the new life in Christ. So there's and then Jesus talks about there's a wedding feast, and people are invited to come in, and a man comes in and he doesn't have the right wedding garments. Now, garments represent the righteousness of the saints. If we're naked, then we're ashamed and we don't have any kind of clothing. But when we are clothed with righteousness, then we are wearing the right garments. Now, the gate, in some ways, it also represents judgment. That the elders would sit at the gates and they would judge cases. Like Moses, he had the people come to him deciding right and wrong. Solomon, he would decide different cases. So in our form of government in the United States, we have a jury system where you're judged by a jury of your peers. You can request to be judged by your peers, and so that's kind of what the gate is. That's the door. It's a protection against the enemy. It's protection against people coming in and stealing or hurting or robbing or anything like that. Now, in kind of a similar way, the roof of the church, it's also kind of like the leadership, like the gate. The gate is a regulator, but the roof of the church is like the administration. It's over everything. It's kind of like, okay, in the same way that men are over women in a marriage, the administration is over the church. So you have the main leadership is the pastors, the elders, the deacons, and the bishops. Any kind of minister, music minister, the ministry of helps, of money, the different functions of how the church is going to function with money. So one of the most important things in leadership is to have a vision and to be looking ahead and not reacting, but responding, and also having a plan ahead of time. And so, like Paul says, you shouldn't have a leader that's a novice. You need somebody that's experienced and also has a moral authority and also is competent. I guess it's kind of like any other profession. You need somebody that knows what they're doing. In some ways, a pastor, it's more, you have to be more skilled with people than probably any other position, because you're working with people that they're voluntarily under your authority, and if they don't like what you're doing, they could just leave, or you don't really have any what do you call it? You don't have any ties to them necessarily. They could just leave if they wanted to. So I guess what are the components of leadership in the church? I guess the things that are most needful are I guess if you look at a father, okay, if you look at a family, a father, he goes out and he brings in money for the family, and he administers discipline to the children, and hopefully he has a vision for the family also, as far as like teaching and whatnot. And so I think the goal of all leaders is that you mature other leaders, you make disciples. Jesus said we're supposed to make disciples of all nations. So the whole process, the whole administration of the church, the purpose is to raise up new leaders. It's to raise up competent leaders and skilled leaders. So I think it's done in many ways through teaching, as far as spiritual training, learning how to pray, learning how to worship, learning how to preach, learning the Bible, learning what the doctrines of the Bible are talking about as far as grace and mercy, righteousness, the whole idea of Christ's sacrifice, who he is, who we are in Christ, the nature of God. There's a bunch of things that people really need to learn, and they're not necessarily easy things to understand, not easy things to learn, but they're not that hard either. If we're diligent, if we study, it should be fairly easy to acquire these kind of knowledge, but it's almost like a gift too. I mean, some people are just called to be pastors, evangelists, prophets. These are different giftings that the Lord gives in the church, and teacher, and like the different spiritual gifts is like speaking in tongues, a word of prophecy, interpretation of tongues. There's a whole number of spiritual gifts that people are given also for the edifying of the body. Now, we need really good leaders, and I was looking at the structure of a church, of a roof. There's usually two sides, and one side is kind of the priestly function, and the other side is the kingly function. Like Jesus, he had a dual nature. He's like a priest of the order of Melchizedek, and he's interceding for us before the Father, and he's also a king, so he has authority, and he's going to judge in the white throne judgment seat also. And so he's been given all authority under heaven and earth. So that's kind of the administration in a church. You have a priestly function where you're interceding for people, spiritual growth and prayer, and also kind of a civil authority as far as a king, where you have the power to execute judgment and also to reward people, to go to war. I think the king's duty is to go to war and fight. So, and also a priest's function is to minister to his family. So that's it's kind of a dual function of the leadership in a church, is to be a king and a priest. So I don't believe in just one leader necessarily in a church. I think from what I've seen in history, they had in the early church they had like 3 leaders. There were elders, and one was the main pastor. And I think that's important to have a number of pastors, and you have different ministers for different functions. I think like teaching is very important. We in the church have really fumbled the ball here as far as teaching. The amount of ignorance in the United States as far as the Bible is just shocking. I would say most people haven't even read the Bible that are Christians, and that's just terrible. You can't. How could you even function as a Christian and not even know the Bible or read it? And not only to read it, we need to really dig into it and study, and to understand the different doctrines. I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I'm trying to discuss this whole idea of leadership and what the church should be doing. And as far as discipline, I think like the gates, it's kind of a discipline of the church itself, and also outsiders. But there's a certain discipline that the church leadership needs. They have to be diligent in as far as the doctrines of the church. If a roof starts leaking, it gets hit by rain and snow and sleet and hail and all sorts of stuff, and roofs have to be replaced periodically. And that's kind of what leadership has to be. We kind of have to change with the times. Every generation has to have their leadership and their vision and kind of how they deal with the world at that point. And so I see a roof as needing to be replaced, every 10, 20 years, something like this. It can't just be, forever the same thing. It's going to change in a sense. But the main problem with a roof is if it leaks. If you start getting leaks in a roof, the water goes down into the walls. It gets in the roof. It gets into insulation, and you can get mold and funguses. All sorts of bad things start happening when you get leaks in the roof. And you want to be really diligent that doesn't happen. And so when the church allows wrong doctrines in the body, it's preaching from the pulpit the wrong things. For instance, I think the way that the church today has been tied to the state, as far as the military, and I think the church needs to be very careful about stuff like that. And it's become very weak, very ineffective, not very much voice. It's basically irrelevant, and people don't even listen to the church whatsoever. And so the reason is because the church has become an arm of the state, and it needs to be distinct and different from the state as far as especially this government, which is not Christian. It's very anti-Christian. So how could the church tie into the government so closely when it's fighting against the church itself? So we have to be very careful about stuff like that. Anyway, that's a little bit of what I was thinking about as far as the roof of God's house of the church. So this is Liberty Mark 222. Thanks.